Hello and welcome to the MIT Open Documentary Lab talk. My name is Sarah Wallison. I'm the director of the lab. I am a white woman with silver hair and I'm wearing a black shirt and jacket. I also want to acknowledge that I'm sitting on the land of the Massachusetts and their neighbors, the Wampanoag and Nipmuc peoples who have stewarded this land for hundreds of generations. It's my great pleasure today to introduce MIT professor Christine Walley, Director of Media Development at MIT Open Learning, Chris Boebel, and media artist and Open Doc Lab alum, Jeff Soyk. It's my particular pleasure because this project originated here at the lab. So it's very exciting to see it come to fruition. This was about 8 years ago when the first idea was seeded. It's also interesting because it's a collaboration between a scholar, a filmmaker, and a technologist. Of course, all of their roles blur and they handle different parts, but you know, it is what our lab is about and espouses. So it's also a wonderful collaboration with the Southeast Chicago Historical Museum. So we're really excited to hear how they collaborate and learn about this project. You can learn more about them in their bios, which we'll put in the chat. And before I turn it over to them, I did want to say to remind people, if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A. After the presentation, we will have a panel discussion, and then we will also put your questions forward. So without further ado, Chris, and Jeff.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much. And thank you, Sarah, for the land acknowledgement. And we're all just extremely excited to be here. As Sarah mentioned, the idea for this project actually was birthed at the Open Doc Lab many years ago, and it's where we've met Jeff and learned about his amazing work. And so it's really nice to kind of bring it back home and show the work that's been created after many years. So thank you all so much. So I think we're just going to hop right in. I think we're just going to go hop right into the talk. And let me go ahead and share screen. So basically the idea was we're just going to give you, tell you a bit about who we are, how we came to do this project. And then we're going to take turns talking about the process of creating the website that we've been working on, the Southeast Chicago Archive and Storytelling Project. So we'll tell you a little bit about the process and show you through some of the site. And then we're very excited to have conversation and feedback with all of you. So basically, we want to tell you about this project we've been working on called the Southeast Chicago Archive and Storytelling Project. And so this project, as Sarah mentioned, has been a collaboration with an all-volunteer community museum, the Southeast Chicago Historical Museum. And it's been collaborative on a whole range of different levels. And we're going to talk a bit at the end about the varieties of kinds of collaboration that's been involved in this project. And first, if we see the next slide, Jeff. So the landing page for the project itself. And then the next slide, we'll show you the names of some of the project team who's been involved in this project. There's been a lot of folks involved. And so we just wanted to give a shout out to everybody who's been involved for all the incredible work they've put in over many years. We started working on this project, as was mentioned before, back in 2013, 2014. So it's been a lot of years. So we just wanted to quickly start off by telling you a little bit about how we came to work on the project and a bit about our own backgrounds, because as Sarah's mentioned, we're each coming from very different places. So if we can go to the next slide, Jeff. So basically this project is about an area, Southeast Chicago, that's part of what's referred to as the Calumet region, which includes Southeast Chicago and Northwest Indiana. So the Calumet region is a former steel mill region. So over a century, it attracted a range of different groups to work in the steel mills. Initially, most of these were European immigrants, most of them from Eastern Europe, a lot of Poles. But then starting around World War I, there was also large numbers of Mexican Americans as well as African Americans who came to work in the steel mills. The population of Southeast Chicago right now is primarily Latinx. And if we could see the next few slides, Jeff, this just gives you some sense of a bit about the region. Yeah, and you can stop here, Jeff. Thank you. So like in many Midwestern industrial communities, beginning around the 1980s, the steel mills in Southeast Chicago started to close. And there was a sense for many people in the area who'd been there for generations that they were losing not only their livelihoods, but in many sense, for many, a sense that they're also losing their collective past. And so the Southeast Chicago Historical Museum was founded in the early 1980s. So it was founded in the midst of when all of this kind of economic collapse was happening. And so what happened then was people started donating their materials to this museum. And, you know, materials that people found meaningful about their past. And so this project then basically really operates somewhere in the borderlands between anthropology and history. So there's this real kind of fascination for us with what people say from the past, why it was so important to them, what this tells us about what history looks like from the point of view of people who lived in this diverse working class community. And if you can share the next slide down to. Yeah, maybe one more. Oh, okay, we'll stop there for now. Well, actually, you can go to the next one, Jeff. Go ahead. So basically, so that's very quickly the project again has been this this collaboration with this community museum that was really kind of created out of this economic rupture and disruption that happened with deindustrialization in this community. So how did we come to create this website project that we're going to be telling you about, and why are we interested in doing it? So again, each of us who's on this call, we're coming from different backgrounds. I myself, as an anthropologist, I teach here at MIT, but I also grew up in Southeast Chicago. My own family on both my mother's side and my father's side had been there for multiple generations. My father had been a steel worker, my grandfather, my great-grandfather. And in 2013, I ended up writing a book called Exit Zero, which was about the long-term impacts of the loss of industrial work in the region. Exit Zero, the reason why it's called Exit Zero is that's was the name of the old exit ramps off the highway for the steel mill areas, and it really kind of signifies how this place became kind of a passed over area. We also made a documentary film. It was directed by Chris, the other Chris on the call, and he's going to tell you a little bit more about the film in a minute. But both the book and the film used autoethnography, basically a reflection on my own family's experiences, to explore the long-term impacts of deindustrialization and to really give some analysis of how and why they came about. So there was a lot of scholarly research that went into the book, but I didn't want to present it in a standard academic style. So the book was written in a more autoethnographic style that focused really on storytelling. And the reason for doing it in that kind of way was not for kind of intellectual reasons, it was really for personal reasons. And for me, when I was a working class teenager, basically, and I started reading academic works about Southeast Chicago and about the steel mill area, I remember very clearly as a young person feeling somewhat offended by it, because those academic books very much felt like they were written about people other than the people in Southeast Chicago. So they were books about people like my family, but not intended for us. And there was a real sense of alienation for that. And so when I decided to start doing academic work around Southeast Chicago, it was really important for me to do work in some other kind of way that at least invited people in the area into the conversation. And so that was a lot of the impetus for working in a more autoethnographic mode and engaging in more kinds of storytelling. And again, so people would kind of feel more pulled into the conversation. And I have to say, and Chris might talk about this a bit more, but we've been proud of the fact that that's actually worked out in Southeast Chicago. A lot of people have read the book or seen the film. We've had a number of community screenings in Southeast Chicago. The film is also showed on PBS in the area multiple times. And one of the things that's been really great is when you engage in storytelling, people respond back with stories of their own. So what's been nice at these community screenings is that, you know, people see the film and they kind of get up and they respond with their own family stories about what happened in terms of the kind of economic ruptures that happened in this area over the last multiple decades. But there's also limitations to doing autoethnographic work. I mean, my own family is a white working class family, but Southeast Chicago is this incredibly diverse region historically, as I mentioned. And so there's all these other stories in the area across neighborhoods, across ethnic and racial groups. And so one of the concerns became, well, what about all these other stories? How do we pull some of those other stories out? And so it was really, working with this community museum in both the book and the film that we got inspired and excited about the idea about all the stories that were kind of encapsulated in the objects that people in the area had themselves saved and then donated to the museum. And so for us, one of the we were excited about this idea, working in an online format. Would it be possible to do multilinear storytelling that really draws out the multiple kinds of stories around this region across ethnic and racial and neighborhood groups? So for our end, that was the impetus basically to start working on this website project. And I think Chris is going to talk about this a bit more, but as we mentioned, earlier, Open Doc Lab was just getting going at that point. We went to many early events, and kind of Sarah and William both kind of challenged us, are there parts of your work that might work well in this kind of format? And we really felt that the work with the museum could really benefit by working in this kind of way, and again through this kind of multilinear storytelling. So that's how we started to come to the project, and Chris is going to talk a bit more about that.
Hey everyone, so I'm Chris Boebel, and I'm the other Chris's spouse, first of all, probably important to mention. And I started going to the area close to 30 years ago. Started spending time there not long after I had met Chris. And we often say that the sort of the book and the movie grew up together. They were both much discussed and much talked about from the very early days and sort of the early to mid 1990s when we first were together and first spending time in the area together. And for Chris, of course, her obsession and engagement goes much further back than that. But even in the early 1990s, this process of deindustrialization was still happening. It was sort of that era was drawing to a close because very few mills were left at that point. Chris's father had lost his job about 10 years previously, or a little more than 10 years previously in 1981. But the aftermath of that was still very fresh and very raw when I first met Chris's family. So as Chris worked on various iterations of the book, early versions that were, master's theses and so on, we talked about making a movie. And I think the first idea was that we would make kind of a, sort of a public affairs documentary with interviews and sort of an academic analysis of deindustrialization and what the economic impact had been. But it became very clear very quickly that the real story that we wanted to tell was a very, very personal one to Chris and to her family. So the documentary is really structured around the stories of her father, her mother, her grandfather, and then Chris herself. And we really were attempting to take those stories and make these very personal stories blend or comment upon these sort of larger social forces, so to speak, of deindustrialization, economic collapse, and so on. And we were kind of walking a tightrope between the two of, really trying to stay close to the lived experience of Chris and the rest of her family, but also deal with the sort of the larger social issues. But as Chris mentioned, the real limitation of that is that you don't stray too far from the personal. You can't sort of digress and start talking about other immigrant experiences or other aspects of the story or the neighborhood. And this web project is really the result, as Chris mentioned, of really a challenge that I think Sarah and William gave us years ago when Open Documentary Lab was first forming, to basically, try using other media forms to do the same thing, but with other material, other stories. In other words, take other personal stories, other lived experiences, and try to link them up in similar ways to what we were doing in the movie and the book. The other thing, of course, that came out of this very early engagement with Open Documentary Lab is that we met Jeff, who is this fabulously talented designer and technologist who at the time and since then was working in this emerging media form of interactive documentary. I'll let Jeff introduce himself, but suffice to say that we started speaking with Jeff many years ago about working with him on this project, but it was a number of years before we were actually ready to start the design process. And we're going to take you through some of that early development work as well. But Jeff, go ahead and introduce yourself.
Hey everyone. So I've worked in the interactive doc space since about 2012, and I was a fellow. I'm forgetting my years. I think it was like 2016 or so. Fellow at the Open Doc Lab for a couple of years, and since 2012, I've just been working on various projects like Hollow in 2013, Inheritance with PBS Frontline in 2015, and then a project called Document Hotline that came out last year. And basically the roles that I tend to play in these projects, they tend to, a lot of these times these project teams are pretty lean, so it's a lot of overlap, but involves creative direction, storytelling, UX design, UI design, some front-end development, various forms of project management and such. But yeah, so in terms of this project, as both Chris has mentioned, I met them at the Open Doc Lab, and I just personally love old objects. It's just a personal interest of mine in general, but I just love the idea of this kind of all volunteer run museum in South Chicago that kind of was, described as this kind of quirky yet rich archive, and especially this idea of residents, choosing the objects to preserve in their community and what they kind of deemed valuable, and how it kind of gave insight into this almost like history between the lines, representing everyday life there. I thought that was really kind of fascinating in terms of kind of expanding typical narratives for that region. Definitely very interested in peripheral narratives, and kind of gaining more, greater insight into human experience through these kinds of alternative narratives than we're used to. And I love the idea too of kind of opening the conversation among community residents and also students in an academic setting. I think a lot of these materials have a great opportunity to not only provide, various education around the kind of topics and events and things, but also kind of open up a conversation and really have some meaningful discussion and debate in the classroom. So that was my kind of interest, and it's a little bit of my background in getting involved. But yeah, and then it's, again, I don't even know how many years it's been since we've been working on this project, but I'm not even gonna try and remember it. COVID hasn't helped with keeping track of time, but so yeah, I'll pass it back to Chris.
Great, thanks, Jeff.
Yep.
If you can just get the next slide, please.
Sure.
Thank you. Great. So just before we take you through the process of creating the website, we should tell you a little bit more about the museum itself. So this museum, as we've already talked about it, so it's an all volunteer community-led museum. So it's been gathering materials for about 40 years now. So it's really just one room in a park field house. It's only open 1 day per week, has no phone. It only got internet access last year after 39 years. And again, all volunteer. But despite this, it has a really remarkable collection. I mean, so what the folks who worked at this museum have gathered is really extraordinary. So there's about 180 oral histories that are part of the collection dating back to the 1970s. There's about 10,000 images. There's about 350 reels of film or VHS tapes. There's about 250 pieces of clothing, countless documents. It goes on and on. And as an anthropologist who works on issues of deindustrialization, I really don't know any other place that has this kind of collection for a deindustrialized region in terms of either the breadth or the size of it, but also in terms of the fact that it's been completely generated by residents of the area themselves and maintained for almost 40 years. So as we've been talking about, so the idea for this for the website, the Chicago Archive and Storytelling Project, was again to use a website that really uses the objects that people in Southeast Chicago themselves had saved over all these decades and the stories they told about these objects, largely through the oral histories. and to use both the objects and the stories then to really kind of convey some kind of a sense of what it's meant to be working class for different ethnic and racial groups in this region, and how that's shifted from the industrial to the post-industrial period. But we should say, as Chris also mentioned, that it was a lot of years before we could even get to the design part of the website. And because the museum was an all volunteer institution, it never had a professional archivist. And the volunteers did an absolutely amazing job given the incredible volume of material that they had. But there's still, of course, limits based on that. So it was really hard to find things. Not everything was recorded. Most of the records for the objects for what had been donated were often kind of handwritten in paper notebooks. So even before we were able to start thinking about the design for the website project, we had to spend lots of years just kind of figuring out actually what was in the museum and getting things, getting the materials there recorded in an online archival database, so we can even kind of find out what was there and be able to hook it up to the website. And I remember working on the very first grant for the project, and literally kind of, just sitting on the floor, counting reels of film and counting numbers of VHS tapes, and open another file cabinet and, oh, there's like 10 more reels of film here. And so those first couple years of the project were really just spent kind of doing an inventory and getting the materials into an online database. And we really have to give a shout out here to the archivist for the project, Derek Potts, who's been working on this for and with the volunteers at the museum for many years now. And just to give you kind of a quick sense then of the basic architecture of the site, and I think we're going to go live here in terms of taking you to the site and exploring the site. Okay, is everybody seeing the archive itself? Okay. So basically, in designing the site, and I should also say that for this whole project, then we've had an advisory committee for the project, and that's included so we've been collaborating with the volunteers at this museum, but we've also had an advisory committee that's also included other representatives from the community, and then folks from a couple of the major museums in Chicago, so from the Field Museum and the Chicago History Museum, and they've been giving feedback, and we've been in discussion with them this whole process for many, many years now about how this website would work and what would be included in it. But in terms of the design and so in thinking about the architecture of the site, so basically what we ended up with is that this website would have two sides. So one side is a digital archive, and the other side is what we're referring to as it's a storytelling side with these storylines that Chris and Jeff are going to talk about a bit more. But in terms of the archive, I'm just going to take you quickly through how we thought about the archive. One of our own, in thinking about how to do an online archive for this kind of project, one of the things that I think we all felt was that, if you look at a lot of digital archives online, often there's really incredibly beautiful objects, and you might get all this kind of meticulous metadata. But at least for me, sometimes you wouldn't kind of know answers to things that you really wanted to know about. And one of the things I'm always really curious about is like, who donated these items, or more about that person. Why was that person interested in these objects? Why did they donate them? What kind of meaning did these objects have for people? And how do these objects relate to the larger kind of social settings that they had come out of? And so one of the things that we spent a lot of time thinking about was how to help viewers, both from within Southeast Chicago themselves, but other viewers as well, how to give them kind of entryways into this archive, right? Because a lot of times also with digital archives, there might be amazing material, but you don't know enough about what's in the archive to actually know what to search for, what should you be looking for, what's actually there. So we try to create all these kinds of pathways, entryways for people into the archive itself, and to make it accessible to people. And again, this was obviously really crucial for us because we were, collaborating with people in the community, and we wanted this to be tools that would be first used within Southeast Chicago, as well then as for other people outside, a more general public, as well as scholars. So we did a couple of things on the archive end of the website. And one of the things we did was we set up what we call featured curations, which gives people some sense of the kinds of materials that are in the museum, in this collection, and know people and give people a sense of what they can might be wanting to search for. We have some featured items that rotate at the top. That's just kind of like little teasers. And then after that, we have 13 featured curations. And so we created the 13 featured curations around thematics, themes that were well represented within the museum, and stuff we had talked about with the advisory committee about kind of which stuff should be emphasized out of this incredible amount of material. And so we created these 13 curations on different topics. So this one on Black experience in the mills, another one called Women at Work. There's one on unions. There's one on kind of the life cycle. There's one on civil rights struggles, a whole range of different kinds of things. And these featured curations just kind of give you some sense of some of the interesting materials that might be here. And if you can see kind of up on top of particular objects, there's little icons that indicate whether they're, this one's a home movie, for example, photographs, objects, whatever it might be. And you can, you know, click on any of these items. I'll just pull one up for you. So kind of a classic Rosie the Riveter shot. But what we also tried to do then is, again, to make the items themselves more engaging for viewers, is to really draw out the stories again about, so who donated these objects, why did they donate them, you know, kind of what was their story, why these things were potentially meaningful either for themselves personally or for others in the area. And so we created these things that we called backstories, that are kind of like, you know, social histories and storytelling around the objects. And in many cases, we ended up using quotations from oral histories to, you know, to pull in as part of this. And maybe not in this particular one, but in many of them. So you can find out more about the objects. So anyway, so we have these 13 featured curations, as well as these other kinds of items. And again, the idea is to just give people kind of pathways into really encouraging people to explore the objects that are in the archive and why these things might be of interest and value to people within Southeast Chicago itself. And at this point, then I'm going to hand it over to Chris to talk a bit more about how we set up what we refer to as the storylines.
Hey, okay, thanks, Chris. So yes, I will try to share my screen and risk showing things live. Hopefully it'll work. So when you come to the website, southeastchicagohistory.org, this is what you see. It's just a landing page. But if you scroll down, Chris mentioned that there are two sides to the site. There is the digital archive, which is this, the objects we save, and then the storylines. And one of the key things for me is that these two are tightly linked. I'm going to show you in a moment about that. But I'm going to dive into the storylines here. At the moment, we have completed two, Mexican-American Journeys and the Memorial Day Massacre. And I'm going to look into the Memorial Day Massacre specifically. We also have two more in process, and Chris is going to talk a bit about that at the end. So let's look at the Memorial Day Massacre. So the Memorial Day Massacre is a really key historical event, both for the area, the Calumet area, but also for the nation. It's one of the most important events in US labor history. It occurred on May 28th, 1937. And essentially, this was a time of great unrest in the union organizing for the steel industry, and striking workers for Republic Steel and their sympathizers were picketing the plant and had been for a while. But on Memorial Day, they organized a large peaceful demonstration in front of the plant, but they were essentially confronted by a very, very brutal police crackdown. The police were guarding the plant. They had occupied the plant essentially, and they opened fire on this group of strikers, which included women and children, and 10 people were killed and more than 100 were injured. One of the key things about it is that there was a newsreel camera there. You see some of the footage here. And so it's a little bit like police body cam footage today. You know, it was something that was very sort of unheard of at that point. that there was actually images. There were film images of what had actually happened. So when the police later denied what happened and said that the strikers had attacked them with weapons and they were just defending themselves, there was actually footage that disproved that. This led to all sorts of labor reforms. It was, a huge event in labor history, as I said, and sort of, in some ways, helped usher in this, era of accommodation between big business and the labor movement, especially then, sort of, which was enhanced by World War II, which began just a few years later. Anyway, so we tell the story of the Memorial Day Massacre through the objects in the museum. And forward. So every one of our stories or storylines begins with a key object. And in this case, the key object is this scrapbook. And if you look over here, you can see that you can link to the archive and find out more information about this object, as Chris described. The scrapbook was created by a young woman named Jerry Jolly Borazon. She made it to commemorate the massacre. She lived right next to the field where the massacre happened. Her fiance, Steve, later her husband, worked in the mill. Her brother worked in the mill. She was present at the massacre as a young woman. And, just a lot of you may be familiar with this sort of tradition of scrapbooking that a lot of Midwestern women, my family included, will do. Often, though, they're scrapbooking a wedding or a funeral or a party or a graduation. In this case, she was actually scrapbooking a massacre. So this is the key object that everything springs out of. We begin each storyline with a very short video. In this case, we are interviewing her son, and he's on the site of the massacre, also where his mother grew up.
Now, my mom kept a good book. Sad day, sad day. This is where I grew up as a kid. It's on 117th and Buffalo. This dirt road still looks the same as it did when I was growing up here. I had a pear tree right here. And the steel mill was right there. When we lived here, my dad would walk to work. There used to be a brick factory over there. But I guess when the 1937 strike hit, this was all prairie, except for the few houses that were here. And from I remember from that day is what my mom and dad told me. They were pickling the steel mill. All my family was here. My mom, my dad, my uncles, they were all here because they wanted to form the union. And back in them days, they had no rights as workers. And then as my dad would say, the bulls come running down the hill with their nightsticks, shooting people, beating people. And they say it got pretty violent. They seen many of their friends getting hit with the billy clubs, seen a couple of the people that died falling next to them. That was 1937, Memorial Day. Yeah, all this happened right in here.
So we introduced Jerry Jolly. This is her and her brothers when they were children. Again, they grew up right next to the mill and right next to the field where the massacre was eventually going to happen. And again, all of these are taken from the archive. So if you go up to the upper left, you always can go to the archive itself and find out more about each object, each photograph. It's going to go ahead quickly.
They would all march through that big prairie. I lived in the second house right from where we were standing in that prairie.
So this is an oral history with Jerry Borazon, which is part of the archive. So at this point, we go back after that brief introduction, and there's a section on really it's sort of the labor history of the area and some of the things that were going on that led up to the massacre. And navigationally on the, I don't know if you can see this, but on the far right, there's sort of a timeline with chapter headings before the massacre itself, after the massacre, and remembering the massacre. And I'm not going to go through everything because we won't have time. But before the massacre essentially deals with the attempts to organize the steel industry that started, well, had been ongoing, but began again in earnest during the Great Depression.
In them days, they shoveled coal. They each take their turns. As they get in a group, they each take their turns shoveling into the furnace, which is terribly hot. And they just wanted better wages for this terrible labor that they did at the furnaces.
And Jerry's, so it was a very, very difficult life. I mean, working in the mill was extremely difficult. It was dangerous. It was dirty. The wages were very low. You know, this sort of idea that, you know, it was this cushy life with benefits was not at all the case at that point. George Patterson is another character that we follow. He became a union organizer, and there is a really wonderful oral history with him that's part of the.
I myself was born in Scotland and knew about labor movements and was shocked at the Americans' lack of knowledge.
He was born around the turn of the century. This interview was done in 1974, so quite a long time ago. But again, this archive is a very rich source of history, not just of local interest. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that's really important nationally. So Steve Borazon is also interviewed. This is Jerry's husband. And then throughout this story, we return to the scrapbook, and the scrapbook becomes a way into the next chapter. You see this page here, where she's really, you know, the sort of heroes of the labor movement: John Lewis, Philip Murray, both labor organizers, President Roosevelt. You know, she really did this incredible job of creating her own history in the book. So the basic backstory of the massacre itself is that in 1935, President Roosevelt signed the Wagner Act, which actually gave workers the right to unionize. So you know, forming unions were then legal, and soon after that, the larger steel companies like U.S. Steel settled with the union. They did not want labor trouble, so they settled. But smaller companies like Republic, and Republic was notorious, the so-called little steel companies did not settle, and in fact set out to violently disrupt the union organizing. And they formed partnerships with the police. They stocked weapons and tear gas at the plants. They brought in scabs when people went out on strike. And so this became a very, very tense confrontation that went on for
there was an enormous advance. Of course, first of all, you had the right to organize, that you were being punished, you weren't being killed for it, you weren't being jailed. You had the right, it was the law. And that was absolutely revolutionary.
So I'm just going to skip ahead here.
We took it for granted that spies, the stool pigeon. My general statement was, remember tonight, gentlemen, you who are here, know that amongst us there are a couple of stool pigeons.
So the tension with the Republic of Steel came to a head in May 1937, when a strike was called, and lots of other workers in the area walked out in sympathy with Republic Steel. And there were a number of protests and pickets and confrontations with the police who were guarding the plant. I'm going to skip ahead to the massacre section. So again, we begin with the scrapbook.
That was a gorgeous day. It was beautiful. It was warm. And there were thousands of people there.
they would all march through that big prairie. I lived in the second house right from where we were standing in that prairie.
I watched the Paramount newsreel fellows set up their newsreel cameras on the truck, and I listened to some of the police talking to themselves, saying, let those bastards come down here, we'll take care of them when they come down.
And was right up there in front as we marched through the...
I walked right between the lines.
This is George Patterson. So throughout the story, you can also click on these tabs that give you more background, more information. Captain Mooney was the head of the police detail there. Later lied about what happened during the massacre itself. So this is the newsreel footage, and again, it was quite disturbing at the time because it was sort of a new idea, a new thing that there would be a newsreel actually capturing an event. And I'm just going to play a little bit of the newsreel of the massacre itself. What we've been seeing images that were filmed by the newsreel crew before the police opened fire. So you can replay the footage with controls. You can slow it down.
And I see the guys falling like wheat to my right. And those are the ones that get killed. They get shot.
I looked around and I really, for the first time in my life, saw a battlefield. Because that's what it looked like. It was a battlefield.
So we have a number of eyewitnesses whose oral histories are included in the museum as well. And
everybody started running back, and everybody was frightened, but I ran right home because I lived right there.
So 4 people died on the field.
People were just dragging bodies towards Sam's place. There was a policeman pointing a gun in my back and saying, "Get off the field or I'll put a bullet through your back." It was just a horrendous, absolutely horrendous sight. There was one father who carried his kid, and one of the bullets hit the child's foot and shot off the heel of his foot.
Anyway, I'm going to skip to the aftermath after the massacre. 4 people died on the field, 6 more died later from their injuries, and nearly 100 people were wounded. So it was quite a traumatic event, to say the least. These are the death certificates of the people who died, and you can actually go in and explore each of them. Thousands of people attended the funerals. We have newsreel footage of that. And then the aftermath really involved a lot of controversy over what exactly happened. As I said, the police initially told a story that the demonstrators were violent, that they were Marxists, they were Reds, that they had attacked them. But the newsreel footage showed something completely different. It showed men, women, children being shot in the back by the police who opened fire on them. And
oh no, that's all nonsense. That's entirely the fabrication of the media, as they say today. No one had any intent of ever going inside the plant. All we wanted was a picket line outside of the plant. No weapons, nothing. The only weapon that a worker had was a...
So eventually this all came out after a lot of public outcry. there was a commission that was formed, a congressional commission called the La Follette Committee, and they did a lot of investigation. And although they did conclude that it was a peaceful demonstration, no police were ever prosecuted. No one was ever prosecuted for what had happened. I'm going to jump to the end. The last section is remembering the massacre. And, you know, at the time it was a very significant national event, but of course it also was an incredibly traumatic event for the people in the community. There were a lot of national commemorations, paintings, novels. But the thing that's really interesting is that the community itself has continued to commemorate the anniversary. This was the first anniversary. This is the 70th in 2007.
My home is over Jordan. Deep river, I want to cross over
So that is pretty much the end. We end with the scrapbook again, and this is the last page of the scrapbook. This is really quite amazing. So this is May 30th, 1997, the 60th anniversary, and there are pictures of Jerry actually sharing her scrapbook with people at the anniversary. So she clearly wanted to remember this was what, you know, this was her own museum in a sense. This is Jerry.
We were in it. Our whole crowd here, we were all in
And
it.
she played hooky for school those days.
Yeah, but my husband Steve, we were only sweethearts at the time.
Oh, yeah?
I were. But later on, we got married on his back wages.
Oh, okay.
On his back pay.
So now what's your name now?
Well, my maiden name was Jolly, but now it's Borzon. Steve Borzon.
Steve Borzon, okay.
Thank you.
So she donated the scrapbook to the museum in 2002 and passed away in 2014 at the age of 96. Then we end with a video again of her son Mike at the memorial that is on the site of the massacre. This little torch statue here. So I'll end it there for time. But I think Jeff is going to talk a bit about the process of developing these stories.
Sure. Yeah. So I'll try and keep this succinct because I know I'm going a little bit long on time. But just to give a sense of what went into creating them, obviously we wanted to kind of create them in the vein of kind of an interactive documentary, but also had to be very mindful of the complexity of them, especially, you know, just in terms of their long-term sustainability and web maintenance over time, because ultimately this is going to be passed to the museum for the long term. So we didn't want to do anything that would obviously start to break over time. We want to be kind of responsible in the build. Although we had a front-end developer and back-end, developer for the archive portion of the website, we actually didn't have them for the storylines due to COVID complications. So it definitely made for an interesting process for us. I was really the only coder for those. I've never coded this much in my life before, and now I now consider myself a developer. So it's but it was a workflow that included both Chris's, myself. Paige Mazurek helped with images and video editing and storyboarding, and we had a sound designer, Billy Raznick, as well. Pulling from sounds from the archive and helping with some of the ambiances and things like that. But ultimately, just to kind of give a quick sense of the process, Chris and Chris, as kind of lead storytellers with the most knowledge of the museum and the region and events, and working closely with the museum volunteers, would draft initial story outline and identify museum materials of interest. And then that kind of outline would be refined. I'd be brought in at various points to provide thoughts and feedback on the story content and structure. as well as discuss potential, custom media that we wanted to consider to strengthen it. We further refined that. Chris Boebel and myself would kind of begin to envision the story as it translates to like the screen-to-screen web-based piece, with being thoughtful about flow and use of the content and media. And myself and Paige would kind of take it one step further and storyboard it with kind of visual sounds and interactivity in mind as like a top-to-bottom UX, experience, and make any suggestions and shifts to content or structure that would still serve the intended takeaway for the piece. But ultimately, obviously, we have to prep a ton of media materials, photographs, documents, audio interviews, any kind of custom sounds, editing videos. And once we had kind of consensus, which included feedback from the museum committee, we would code the functional storyline, or I'd code that, and we would make adjustments after it was coded as needed, and then do some user testing. Though obviously COVID made that added challenges there. I'm hoping we can do more user testing than we've been able to do because of those limitations. But yeah, just kind of some quick insight into the very succinct version of our process.
Thanks, Jeff. And sorry, we want to. I could just give a quick 2-minute kind of wrap up on a couple of the bigger ideas, and then turn it over to the panel for comments. And I just wanted to say, I don't know if any of you are familiar with Martha Langford's work, but one of the things she talks about is albums, how photo albums are actually oral technologies and not visual technologies. And what she means by that is that, when people were creating photo albums back in the day, I mean, what they did with them was share them with others. They would use those albums as chances to tell stories across generations. And so it was really devices to encourage storytelling. And she talks about how when things like photo albums end up in museums, or scrapbooks end up in museums, that they become what she refers to as suspended conversations. And a colleague said about this project as we were developing, he said, oh, what you guys are trying to do is reanimate those suspended conversations. And I thought that was a really nice way to think about it. And I think a lot of what we're trying to do also, at least within Southeast Chicago in particular, is kind of reanimating also those intergenerational conversations through the objects that people historically saved. And across the kind of ruptures that have happened around both deindustrialization and because of other kinds of issues in the area. And so those videos at the beginning there, Chris showed the one with Mike Borazon. Each of the storylines starts with a key artifact. And as Chris said, then there's kind of video around that shows somebody, a family member or some contemporary person who has a connection to that object, talking about what that object means for people now. So linking these objects, that they're not just objects from the past, but they're about the current moment as well. And they have this kind of intergenerational valence and power for people in the area. And so we really try to underscore that kind of intergenerational aspect. And then just finally to think about the kind of collaborative aspects about this. So this project was collaborative on different levels. I mean, so on the one hand, you have the museum itself, where the materials that were donated to the museum came from people in the community themselves who selected what was meaningful to save. The volunteers at the museum kind of figured out which themes they wanted, how they organized things themselves. So the museum objects themselves were created out of the community, basically. And then there's collaboration, obviously, between ourselves and the folks at the museum, and then collaboration among the project team in developing the storylines. And then there's also another level of collaboration, which has largely been around community engagement with the whole project. And we've been really concerned about and focused on that end. So for example, with the website, we've worked with high school teachers in the area to talk about creating a study guide and to think about how these materials can be used in school settings. The director of the museum used to be the local high school history teacher. He's from the area. And he had a lot of his high school students back in the 90s do a lot of the oral histories that are in the museum. That's how they came to be here. And so we're trying to kind of resurrect that program with contemporary high school students. We've also worked with some of the local unions about preserving some of their materials. and other groups as well. And so the project is also intended as a public engagement project in some sense with folks in Southeast Chicago who've been involved in a lot of different ways. And the two other storylines that we're working on, one is about the closing of the steel mills, and then the final one is about environmental activism. There's a lot of pollution in the area, both industrial pollution and also more contemporary kind of post-industrial forms of pollution. And there's a lot of environmental activism that's been largely led by Latina women environmental activists. And so we're working very closely with them in developing this environmental, a storyline around the kind of environmental activism. And what's important about that one is that it brings it up to the current moment, brings it up to the present, and again, makes it kind of living history. So it's not just history of the past, but about the contemporary community as well. So Jeff and Chris, I don't know if you had any other thoughts before we hand it off to the panelists?
No, I think we should hand it off to the panelists.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, well, thank you so much. And panelists, if you want to join us, it's just wonderful to see, you know, what happens when you have someone who comes from the community and does scholarship about it, and then you have a filmmaker, and then this beautiful design and technology. It's really a wonderful project. And I also loved hearing about the progression of the project, you know, from the autoethnography in the book, and then the single story, and then, yeah, you know, allowing many more stories to be told. And I actually would love to hear much more about the collaborative process. I think that is key, and you only got to touch on that very minimally. So maybe you would talk a little bit more about how you worked with the museum in particular, because, you know, you had these objects. How did you find these stories? You know, the story finding process and the decision making around what stories, because there's always that part of it.
Yeah, and I could just say, so again, we had working with the museum. So there's a number of museum volunteers. There's a kind of certain core of folks that are really super active. This is often true in a lot of these cases. And we worked really closely with the person who's the director now. So he's this guy who comes from the area, who became the local high school history teacher. And again, it was his students that did a lot of this work. He had a program that he called the Museology program that generated a lot of the oral histories. And so we've worked extremely closely with Rod on things, as well as the other volunteers. And so with this advisory committee, which again includes the volunteers, also other community refs, and then folks from the museums, we meet, we've met many, so like, I don't know, maybe like 5 times a year we meet and have meetings, and we, show people stuff. We get feedback from people on the work, where it's heading. And I've talked about this some with Jeff too. I mean, a lot of the feedback from people is not so much about kind of the design of the website. It tends to be more about other kinds of community engagement and pulling us into helping support people in the other projects that they're already doing, for example. So for example, the local 1033 people, which is the union around Republic Steel, they have all these amazing materials that they themselves had made. They made these incredible historical panels about the Memorial Day Massacre. And they're like, we want this stuff preserved. Can you guys help us out with that? And so we've had lots of these kinds of little community partnerships with different folks to support their projects. And then we get feedback from people along the way on kind of what we've been doing with this. And in terms of the selection stuff about what actually goes onto the website itself, we came up with criteria that everybody agreed on what stuff to emphasize, and like where the gaps and the silences are in the museum collection, because obviously they're there, and how to kind of collect things to fill in those gaps. And so we kind of had that criteria set up. And then within that, then we would kind of pick stuff within that seemed to kind of fit well with where we were going, and then showing it back to folks in the as part of the advisory committee. So I don't know if there are other questions around that part. Or...
Great. Do we have other questions from the panelists? Okay, Artemis.
Yes, thank you for this presentation. And I think it's just so exciting that you that you've seen the potential for these, the objects in the physical collection as windows to society and culture and history, and have kind of in the digital kind of dimension have kind of two main threads, the archive of the objects themselves and these storylines. But I'm wondering if there might be a kind of a, as you're looking for future directions, and especially pedagogically, if you're thinking at all about the kinds of a kind of more experience-based approach to the objects, and a kind of a more object-based and experience-based approach. So like with the flat iron or something, if you might kind of think about the different meanings that has held, versus the story that somebody has to tell about, what was going on in their life when people used those irons. I don't know. I'm just wondering if an experience-oriented approach might actually reanimate the objects for future students and studies.
I don't know, Chris and Jeff, if you had thoughts on that, or. I mean, one thing that we had talked some about the sensory dimensions early on, and we didn't have, whether to do like 3D imaging of objects, and we didn't have kind of the money and the wherewithal to do some of that stuff. But one of the things we have talked about, which would be great moving forward, would be to have people be able to use their phones to be able to do a tour through the area itself, where you could, go to certain locations and kind of pull up materials around that site. And again, Southeast Chicago still has a lot of massive brownfields. So the old Southwork site, and you see this at the, it's in a lot of the materials and the storylines, but, it's just these, kind of barren brownfields with this incredible history that had been there. And so, the power that it would bring if people were able to bring their phones and be able to access those materials on site and do a kind of walking tour. So that's something that we've spent time talking about if we had money moving forward. But Chris and Jeff, I don't know if you had other thoughts on that.
Well, just briefly, I think, so of the 4 storylines that are planned, I mean, there are the 2 that we talked about. There's the environmental story that Chris also mentioned. The object that sort of sparks that one is a jar of pet coke, which is a industrial pollutant that has been dumped in Southeast Chicago in recent years, and really animated a lot of the activism against it. And then the 4th storyline is the sort of collapse of the steel industry itself, deindustrialization. And in that one, I think the experiential side of what it was like to work in the mills is really, really animates that story. The first part, I mean, the people who worked there, mill workers, had a love-hate relationship. I mean, it was, a very dangerous job, a very dirty job, a really tough job. I mean, the idea was like, if you're there after 70, the first 3 days, then you're a lifer essentially, because the people who could do it really developed this very tight camaraderie. And, they talk about it sort of as if they were in the military, and sort of the shared experience being really, really powerful. So there's we are really focused a lot on the experience of mill work in that one. Because I mean, we're absolutely fascinated with the sort of experiential side of things. The storyline we showed was, of course, historical, and something that is very much like, kind of a known historical event rather, and so we're trying to get at that through the experience of the people who live through it. In other places, we're talking more about a sort of an environmental, experiential kind of story, if that makes sense.
Okay, Vivek, you have a question.
Yeah, thanks. First of all, it's just a really astounding project, and we've all been engaging around this project for many years, and I remember when I think the book was not yet published, and the the film was in rough cut form. And partly what I'm interested in, that I'm thinking about watching this now, and how rich the web project is really about hearing about the kind of shifts in creative engagement, or kind of visualizing what you're doing, moving from one medium to another, right? From first Chris, from book to film, but then there's also a way in which in moving from film to the web project, really kind of harnessed all the many different possibilities that are not available in either of the other two media before, right? So I'm interested in also, just from the standpoint of thinking about the editing process, the storyline that you showed. It's not just, say, a short documentary of 7 minutes that you go and you click and you watch for 7 minutes and then you go back to the rest of the site. There's a much more integrated, or at least to me, what it seemed like was a much more integrated movement back and forth between, say, shorter pieces of video, documents, sound design, clickable objects, or where you can exit from the storyline to look at something in the archive, and then back to video and back through photographs. And it's I'm just interested, I guess, in hearing about the process of envisioning that, and the kind of shift, maybe Chris B, the shift from the editing process, editing a film, to thinking about this other kind of multi-layered medium. And yeah, sorry, it might not be super articulate, but I'm just really interested in that shift from one medium to another.
No, it's a great question. I mean, should I answer it first, I guess? So yeah, first of all, it's not easy. And I think, speaking for myself, and I think Chris W. also, we really relied on Jeff to help us make that transition. And Jeff will probably say, oh, it wasn't easy, to do that. But to me, the key thing that got me excited about doing it, and I could obviously make I could make a 7-minute movie about the Memorial Day Massacre and use all of the footage and the stills. And but what got me excited about doing it this way really is that link between the story and the archive, that every object in that story is part of the archive. And so it's really just kind of a mini collection of things, and you can always find it in the archive. And if you're in the archive, you can always see that something is part of a storyline. So to me, that sort of those threads that you can stitch back and forth give this sense of this being, not just like the story that is this thing that a filmmaker puts together, but rather something that kind of wells up out of this much broader web or collection of things. And so that was kind of my window into understanding it differently, if that makes sense. But the other window in was absolutely Jeff. Jeff constantly being the advocate for let's utilize the technology, let's utilize the form in a different way. And I certainly really appreciate that. I don't know, Jeff, if you have anything to add about that.
Yeah, no, I think you covered it. I mean, it's a process. It's a process that we have to refine over, the first couple of storylines, and we're still refining it, I'd say. But yeah, it's obviously something you just get better at the more you do it, and then we get kind of comfortable with our workflow.
Okay, great. We'll take a question from Rasheen, and then we'll go to the audience. There's a lot of questions in the Q&A.
Thank you. This was, I want to echo Vivek's sentiment that how profound and beautiful this experience is. And it is a process and it is a work to sort of shift the medium, right? Like to a to an interactive space. And with that, I think that's sort of like the space of UX and UI design and how you or making the work inviting and available. And I felt there was so much intricacy in the visual coding and inviting with like this, like a lot of subtlety of information. And again, like visual language of coding that it tells the audience, it makes it much more inclusive in terms of navigating. And you mentioned yourself, like in terms of how there is multiple entry points from different ways of forming the archive, even within sort of one single frame. That I think all of those is what it makes it a really kind of like a powerful and transcended, archive is a form of storytelling, but to do it, that it transcend into a, like a very powerful story, I think it's that's the sort of the hard work. And I feel especially it was happening really beautifully in the space of the story archive, and I could really sort of see the transition between having the objects being this sort of grounding a space and this sort of tactility that I can feel even in the visual space, and come back and forth between this transmedia storytelling form. What I wanted to sort of learn more about was that the section about the object, that segment, and I feel like there is a still like imagination, or there is work that is happening there, because I felt like there is much more storytelling that it was happening with transmedia in the story versus the object archive. And I'm really curious about how you're imagining it and what is the future of it and what is the work that is happening there. You have the collections, you have like different forms of representing them. But I'm also curious if there are shifts that is happening from that space to the storytelling, or there are sort of connections that is happening more between the two. And then in that, like I really also want to command that sort of like, I think you mentioned, Chris, thinking about contemporary and thinking about current and now. This is two maybe comment and question, so I'll say them both. But that sort of historical memory is so important in how we reflect and how we look at now and the policies and the community, and that's really sort of beautiful and powerful that you're already thinking about it. But I feel like also I'm wondering about like how you're envisioning that. If there is time to speak to that a little bit more in terms of how visually these sort of current relationships and conversations with the community and the dialogue that you mentioned is coming into this like archive as well. But thank you for this beautiful work.
Yeah, and those are great questions. And just in the interest of time, why don't you choose one of them and then you can continue after, just so we can get to a couple from the audience. Thanks.
I would just say, unless if Chris and Jeff have something to add on this, but in terms of the historical memory one and bringing it up to the current moment, and again, I think that is really key in terms of thinking about the kind of intergenerational dynamics in Southeast Chicago and kind of, making connections across these ruptures. And one of the things that, I'm not sure if that's exactly what you're asking, but it's what it brings to mind for me. But when showing these materials in Southeast Chicago, what a lot of younger people will say in watching this stuff is like, now I understand my grandmother, or now I understand my grandfather, or the kind of, this kind of intergenerational dialogue. And one of the things that we're really seeing as we're working on our contemporary storylines is, in the union spaces, there's these kind of very elderly old union activists from across all ethnic and racial groups who are incredibly dynamic folks who are, so engaged and really fantastic. And then you've got these really young high school student age environmental activists now, and they don't talk to each other. Like the young people don't know anything about the mills or the unions. They just see, and there's no jobs associated with the contemporary pollution, so they just see it as all bad. And like the old union folks also fought for environmental protections in the mills, but they're not in conversation generationally with each other at all. And so one of the things that we're hoping in terms of thinking about reflecting in historical memory is to bring the different generations together to reflect in both the younger people with the environmental struggles, the older people with the union struggles, and to bring, and literally in conversation. And one of the things we're trying to plan as a community event is to literally get the old union activists and the young environmental activists in the same space, talking to each other. And so I'm not sure if that's exactly what you're asking, but I think there is a lot of work around the historical memory in terms of envisioning what this area can be in the future and moving towards it. And I think reflecting, using these objects as a chance to reflect on those connections and that history, I think is really a key thing. So.
Wonderful. I'm just going to go to a couple questions here. One from William Uricchio. Reanimating suspended conversations. Nice. The project looks wonderful. I'd love to know more about your COVID notwithstanding user testing. How did you define your audience, young, old, local, others? And could you give some examples of insights gained?
Jeff,
I can chime in. I guess we definitely wanted to reach obviously younger students as well as the local community, which includes obviously an older demographic as well. So keeping functionality relatively straightforward and simple was important, not doing anything hyper complex or bringing in any kind of cutting edge tech that required a very big learning curve. We still, we did some user testing earlier on and definitely got some helpful feedback, even with things that things we might have taken for granted, UX wise. But I would say in terms of insights gained, off the top of my head, I can't forget any specifics. There's probably very specific little details in the UI that we had a while back now. I mean, we're probably talking, again, with COVID, it's been complicated to do user testing. So I'm really digging back, but the hope is that now we can start to do some more in-person user testing and get some more feedback, not just on the usability, but also the stories themselves. So that would be nice to do.
And I would just quickly, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was just saying one specific thing, Jeff, that maybe we, sort of evolved was exactly how the objects would link to the archive and what the queue would be, what the tag would look like, how to make it sort of very visible and very obvious without actually having it overwhelm the sort of visual design of the storyline itself. So I know that was something that evolved quite a lot. And, there was a lot of feedback about that because, it's a tough thing. You don't want it to be invisible. You want to have it be very kind of prominent and easy to find and easy to sort of intuitively understand what it is. But at the same time, you don't want it to sort of like take away from the story. So that there was definitely like some evolution there.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, but I mean, the fact that right now you basically can advance just the arrow keys if you want up and down. So hopefully, even with someone just in that simple functionality should get the core experience, even if they don't choose to dive deeper into other elements. But so they're definitely considering different tiers of users.
And I would just say in terms of access, one issue that's coming up too, the archive you can view well off a phone is fine, but for the storylines, because they're so media intensive, you really have to do it off a computer. A lot of people in Southeast Chicago don't have computers. So, so schools, that's part of the reason for putting a big emphasis on the schools. So that's an issue too. We're thinking for the future storylines, how to do them more in a way where people can access them off their phones. But we want to also have this really rich storyline experience. So it's kind of, they're fighting each other a bit.
Yep. That's something I'm investigating ways to make the code a little more efficient and at least get this a little more better functioning on tablets. So it's still mobile, but in a tablet space, phones might still be challenging given the format and the kind of horizontal orientation of everything. things keep changing in the mobile space, in the phone, space. But yeah, so that's definitely on the radar.
All right, so we'll take one more question from Erica Simon. She says, this is so amazing and beautiful. Was any funding provided to the local community in building this? And if so, where did it come from?
The main funding came from the National Endowment for the Humanities. So that was for the project in collaboration with the museum. We also got a couple grants from the Illinois State Archive and Record Board to do some of the materials with the local unions that I had mentioned and some other stuff. We also had the Donnelly Foundation that works with archiving. We have money from them. And then we got money from various pots of money at MIT.
And in terms of going to the community, a lot of the funding that wasn't, specifically for design and construction, a lot of funding has gone to the museum. So, the project has supported an archivist for a number of years who has, just aside from the website, just brought the collection up to a completely sort of different stage in terms of its organization, the metadata, the way things are set up in the museum itself. So a lot of basically just allowing the museum to sort of continue to survive and get to sort of another level beyond just a few hours a week of volunteer work has come from that funding.
Great. All right, so I think we're out of time, but thank you so much for a wonderful presentation, an incredible project, really so exciting to see it, and it's beautiful, as everyone has said. And thank you to all the panelists and to the audience for your questions. And we will be back in 2 weeks, not next week, not the week after, but the week after, the 29th, with Sasha Wares from the National Theater Project. And until then, enjoy and thank you.